Auschwitz Birkenau, April 1945. Allied forces were closing in, and the camp was a collapsing machine of death and desperation. Emaciated bodies crowded under shattered barrack roofs, and guards who had once moved with crisp authority now moved with a new strain at their edges. Among the officers and female overseers present was a name that would be whispered in survivor testimony and written in trial transcripts as a symbol of personal cruelty: Irma Grese, a young woman whose presence at the selections and in the camp yards left an imprint of terror. Investigators later cataloged numbers that make the scene stark. Thousands deported in months, hundreds selected to die at train sides and gas chambers, and survivors who recounted the face of one guard again and again. The smell of smoke and disinfectant mingled with the metallic tang of fear and blood. In this account, we will trace the path that took a girl from a small town into the mechanized brutality of the camps, the training that normalized violence, the acts that marked her as notorious, and the legal reckoning that followed. We will listen to survivors read passages from reports, examine trial evidence, and ask how institutions turned individual choices into systematic cruelty. How did a woman of barely 21 come to be called by survivors the Hyena of Auschwitz? How did the machinery of state transform appearance into authority and cruelty into procedure? Let us begin at the origin. Irma was born into a modest household in Lower Saxony in 1923 to parents Kurt and Elise Grese. The family lived a modest life in a town that felt the aftershocks of the First World War and the economic shocks of the 20s and 30s. Kurt worked odd jobs at the train depot and Elise managed the home, but at times the household balance tilted toward scarcity. As the Nazi movement promised order and restoration, young people found in party youth organizations structured belonging and clear hierarchy. Irma joined a local girls' group, then later opportunities presented by the Reich Labor Service and auxiliary positions offered in wartime institutions. Her family life contained small fractures: a school transfer after a disciplinary episode, a whispered neighborly speculation about a liaison with a local recruiter. In interviews and court records, historians traced a pattern, not of monstrous birth, but of ordinary disruptions feeding into political channels. Teachers and neighbors named basic traits: ambition, a quick temper, and a hunger for recognition. A sister named Gertrude would later say in a deposition that Irma sought uniforms for the status they conferred and the clarity they imposed on an otherwise precarious life. These details do not excuse choices, but they help explain how affiliations and social structures provided a path from adolescence to authority. Her teenage years were marked by short jobs, a failed attempt at clerical training, and a period of medical assistance work where she encountered institutional hierarchies. She applied for positions at various facilities, and in 1942 she received placement training at a facility repurposed for wartime needs. The training environment smelled of liniment and formalin. Its corridors echoed with marching boots and clipped orders. Instructors such as Oberaufseherin Maria Richter and camp physician Dr. Heinrich Vogel taught not only routines but also a lingua franca of efficiency and categorization. Exchanges in a training room, later quoted in testimony, show the tone. Instructor Maria said, "What is the function of selection? Do not hesitate." Irma answered, "The function is to separate the capable from the hopeless." Maria replied, "That is correct. It is not personal. It is duty." Trainee Irma then asked, "And if someone resists, what then?" Maria said, "You remove the obstacle. You are authority." In these 6 exchanges, we see a circuit of instruction, obedience, rationalization, and finally tacit endorsement. The sensory details of that period were stark: the smell of disinfectant, the rasp of boots, the metallic clang of keys, the cold touch of a clipboard, and the taste of nicotine for men in supervisory roles. For someone like Irma, the uniform folded personal insecurity into public power. Her first formal assignment placed her under the supervision of senior staff, including Oberaufseherin Herta Botha and Camp Commandant Josef Kramer. The institution called itself orderly and medical, but practices quickly showed a different function. The discipline was explicit, the hierarchy unambiguous, and violent acts were routinized. Witnesses such as Anna Weiss and Marta Kowalczuk later recounted rituals of inspection, where women were ordered to stand before a guard line, where watches were timed, and where small gestures could become the pretext for punishment. Early acts that would later be catalogued as cruelty appeared to be treated as discipline. A survivor named Samuel Gold recorded in a post-war interview, "I remember a girl with a ring on her finger, laughing as she poked prisoners with the buckle of her belt. She seemed to choose whom to humiliate." These memories are sensory: the crack of leather, the sting on skin, the sudden hush that follows a sob, the smell of urine in crowded latrines, and the harsh, chalky dust of the yard. Technical procedures used to label and separate people were often thinly veiled expertise. A camp doctor would measure physiological markers and pivot to administration of destructive selections. The procedural language masked moral rupture. Escalation was not sudden but accumulative. Over months, patterns intensified. Testimony and internal records reveal methods of coercion, interrogation, choices, and selected medical pseudo-experiments framed as efficiency. A technical description from the liberation reports provided a concise account of how selections were organized. Groups assembled before stacks of paperwork, checked against lists. Those deemed unfit were moved to a separate holding area and then transported. The forensic detail matters here, to understand systematization. The selection process required lists, ledgers, and coded stamps. The procedure relied on transport timetables and coordination across departments. The technical language masked a moral calculus that assigned value to life. The taste of that world was iron and ash. The sound was the churn of a diesel engine pulling a wagon, the feel of cold metal gates closing. Victims like Elsa Nowak, Anna Weiss, Samuel Gold, Marta Kowalczuk, and Jakob Stern appeared in multiple depositions, naming precise moments when a guard singled them out. We must name them to hold the record of action and witness. At the peak of her activity, Irma became recognized by prisoners and staff alike as a figure combining youth and decisiveness. Her interactions with prisoners produced many accounts. In a reconstructed scene from survivor testimony, a young woman in striped clothing rose slowly in the yard in hopes of bread. Guard Irma approached with a cigarette in her hand and said, "Quick." The woman said, "I cannot." The guard laughed and then struck with the cigarette case. The woman fell. A hush settled. Other prisoners watched. The sound of coughs and distant barking dogs filled the air. That moment repeated itself across witness statements, creating a pattern of behavior, small acts that became terror. A reconstructed dialogue between Irma and a senior guard, Karl Mueller, shows internal camp dynamics. Karl said, "You need to be strict. The orders are to keep order." Irma replied, "I do what must be done." Karl said, "Sometimes strict becomes spectacle." Irma laughed and said, "Spectacle teaches, it deters." Karl answered, "You will be noted. Keep your distance." Irma said, "I will keep what I need to keep." These 7 exchanges reveal how guards negotiated cruelty and status among themselves. The sensory palette of these scenes is dense. The whisper of straw underfoot, the bitter smoke of cheap cigarettes, the metallic taste of fear, the scrape of iron on concrete, and the hollow echo of shouted roll call. Personal relationships among guards, like those with Karl Mueller, Fritz Bauer, and Oberaufseherin Herta Botha, formed a network where behavior was monitored, rewarded, and sometimes challenged. The Book of Incidents recorded several climax episodes, selections, rapid deportations, and violent public punishments. We can focus on 4 moments that encapsulate the brutality. First, a midday selection where hundreds were moved to a platform under sun so hot it left sweat salt on clothes. Guards made quick calls. A mother was separated from a child. The child called, and the sound stopped. Many years of silence followed in memory. Second, an attack in a barrack after a rumor of contraband. A search ensued, and a group was lined up and ordered to kneel. Metal boots clicked on packed earth. A guard with a baton shouted, "Who is hiding food? Confess." One prisoner named Jakob refused and was beaten. The sound of fists on flesh echoed for minutes. Third, a transfer to a gas facility where rows moved like clockwork. The smell of gasoline was whispered, though not always present. The dread was immediate and absolute. Fourth, an escape attempt where a small group rushed fences. Alarms screamed, dogs reacted, and guards opened fire. Each of these moments created a shell shock in the memory of survivors, and they required slowed narration to understand the mechanics and the human cost. For each moment, we can slow down rendering details in the tactile plane: sweat, dust, iron, the rasp of breath, and the stinging taste of adrenaline. As the front collapsed and Allied forces advanced, the camp system unraveled, overcrowding and epidemics surged. In the spring of 1945, death from disease overtook many locations, and movement became chaotic. Evacuation orders turned into death marches and transports that further increased mortality. In late April of 1945, British liberators reached a nearby facility, and reports of uncovered corpses and severe mistreatment reached world headlines. The scene of liberation is often described in sensory extremes: the smell of decay overwhelming the nostrils, the sight of skeletal figures emerging from barracks like ghosts, the sound of distant sobs, the gritty texture of frozen rations under fingernails, and the cold of metal gates swung open. Among the captured staff, Irma was identified by survivors, including Marta Kowalczyk and Anna Weiss, who testified that she had been present at selections and had shown particular cruelty. Her capture followed interrogation by Allied military police. A fragment of interrogation dialogue appears in the files. Sergeant Thompson asked, "Why did you do it?" Irma answered, "I followed orders." Thompson said, "Orders do not remove responsibility." Irma said, "I do not remember everything." Thompson said, "You will have to answer to a court." These exchanges show the early legal confrontation between individual claims and institutional responsibility. The trial that followed was part of a larger military tribunal addressing war crimes. In documents from the Lüneburg trial, witnesses gave graphic testimony. Prosecutor James Aldridge read accounts into the record, functions and dates were cited, and forensic reports explained procedures used to determine deaths. The legal frame required translation of brutal acts into charges and evidence. Testimony included statements by survivors, such as Samuel Gold, who said, "She smiled as she struck, she seemed to enjoy it," and medical reports cataloged bruises, fractures, and deaths linked to punitive actions. The courtroom had its own sensory texture: the creak of benches, the crinkle of paper, the murmur of the gallery, and the sharp intakes of breath as evidence was read. Defense arguments sometimes invoked obedience and youth, but prosecutorial narratives emphasized choice and active cruelty. The sentence, Gwyneth Harris, who reviewed trial notes, summarized the court decision stating, "The tribunal found clear evidence that individuals acted beyond lawful duty and were complicit in crimes against humanity." The legal language aimed to create accountability across layers of command. At approximately 1/3 of our narrative, please pause to reflect. If this material is difficult for you to read, you are not alone. Many survivors reported the same shock and disorientation after liberation. These stories are heavy and they demand care. We want to hear from you. What struck you most up to this point? Did a particular testimony or detail surprise you? Perhaps start your comment with "What surprised me was," and share in a few words why your reaction matters. Your comments help build a community conversation and often inspire further investigation. We read them and they shape future episodes. Now let us continue to the final phases of justice and the long-term consequences. The sentence was pronounced in the winter of 1945, and it concluded with an execution carried out at a military facility in December. Execution records list dates, names, and locations, and the method employed was the application of legal penalty under the tribunal authority. After the sentence, friends and family reacted in varied ways. Gertrude Grace gave a brief statement expressing sorrow and confusion, while legal counsel argued for clemency on grounds of youth and coercion. Public reaction ranged from relief to revulsion. Newspaper coverage used stark headlines and photographs of courtrooms to transmit a sense of closure. Yet closure on paper did not equate to healing in communities or for survivors. In the immediate month after the sentence, families of victims began to organize memorials, and many survivors sought basic necessities and medical care. 1 month later, many former prisoners gathered in ad hoc committees to collect documents and to appeal for reparations. Notes from a survivor committee in May 1946 listed needs including housing, documentation, and medical records. 3 months after the trial, former prisoners were still grappling with trauma, but institutions were beginning to build archives. Testimonies were being recorded by historians, and legal teams were preparing subsequent cases. Researchers like Dr. Miriam Adler and Professor Klaus Neumann traveled to interview witnesses and to collect hospital reports. 6 months on, the landscape of memory had begun to take shape. Municipal councils had started modest memorials in some towns, and families had placed plaques in local cemeteries. These processes mattered because legal sentences addressed culpability, but memory work aimed to preserve the voices of victims and to create civic awareness that might prevent recurrence. The epilogue of these months shows an initial movement from immediate survival to documentation and commemoration. First month, grassroots needs and memorial beginnings. Third month, archival collection and legal follow-up. Sixth month, public remembrance and institutional documentation. In the decades after the war, historians continued to debate how to interpret individual agency, systemic coercion, and cultural responsibility. Works by scholars like Dr. Esther Miller, Professor Thomas Reinhardt, and archives held in institutions such as the International Tracing Service provided ongoing material for research. Memorials at Auschwitz and at regional museums include names, testimonies, and artifacts, a continuing attempt to honor victims and to analyze the mechanisms that produced atrocity. The memory of individuals like Irma remained contested, part of legal record, part of public memory, and a cautionary tale about the ways bureaucracy and ideology can normalize cruelty. Survivors continued to testify in oral history projects. Voices like Marta Kowalczyk, Anna Weiss, Jakob Stern, Samuel Gold, and Elsa Nowak remained central to the narrative and to the ethical imperative not to forget. In conclusion, the story of this young guard is not a parable of inexplicable evil, but a layered history of choices, institutions, and historical context. Beginning in a small town shaped by economic hardship, she moved through training into a system that rewarded efficiency and obedience. At each stage, the mixture of personal ambition, social pressure, institutional sanction, and ideological rhetoric provided pathways to acts that had catastrophic effects. Justice arrived in a tribunal, but the moral reckoning continues in archives, classrooms, and memorials. The face of the camp when liberators arrived remains a chilling image of what happens when mechanisms designed for order are used to dehumanize. Recapitulating the opening scene, the smell of smoke and cleansing agents and the sight of skeletal figures recall a failure of civic and human safeguards. The sentence brought legal closure for some, but the broader tasks of remembrance, repair, and education stretched on. For more in-depth investigations of tribunals, archival sources, and survivor testimonies, subscribe to the channel. If this episode affected you, share your thoughts below with respect and care. Your engagement helps keep memory alive and supports future episodes that dig deeper into the documents, the testimonies, and the history. Thank you for listening and for refusing to let these voices be forgotten.